Joining me now in Sydney is co-founder and former deputy leader of Australia's One Nation Party, David Oldfield. In Siem Reap, Cambodia, we have CJ Werleman. He is an activist against Islamophobia and host of Channel the Rage, a podcast aimed at exposing injustice against Muslims. And Farid Hafez is in Salzburg, Austria. He's a scholar with Georgetown University's Islamophobia research project called the Bridge Initiative. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Farid, let me start with you. Besides the man who actually pulled the trigger, who or what do you blame for this grotesque massacre in New Zealand?
Well, I think it's really not about blaming, naming and shaming, blaming a specific person or institution or whatever. I think the larger question that we definitely have to raise is a structural one, because I think it's very obvious that the terrorist, the white supremacist terrorist, was kind of perpetrating an act that was very much founded in right-wing ideology. But at the same time, this ideology is quite hegemonic. It has become hegemonic. Maybe not in the same radical way, the way this terrorist tried to defend his own claims of the invasion of Muslim people in Europe and the West, but rather in more subtle ways. But still, I think this idea that Muslims are kind of a foreign other, that they are trying to reshape the country, this is also prevalent and obvious in so many other political circles, not only on the fringe right, but rather in the center or even in the liberal political camps. So we are facing a quite hegemonic Islamophobic discourse, at the backdrop of which these kinds of terrorisms operate. And it's not, I would not regard it as an isolated incident, as something that has to do with Breivik and other white supremacists, but rather to really look at the larger picture and to see the overall problem that our Western societies are facing in these days, with a structural problem of the widespread of anti-Muslim racism.
Okay, so David Oldfield, an attack like this is merely the fruits of something that was planted a long, long time ago, which is anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim across the board. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, to a degree. I mean, there is lots of anti-Christian sentiment. There's lots of anti-Jewish sentiment. There's lots of anti-Muslim sentiment. Muslims, Christians, and Jews are killing each other in different places around the world. Where did it begin? Look, it began thousands of years ago, didn't it? Isn't that quite clear? And now it's being exacerbated by the movement of Islamic people as immigrants into primarily Western countries where there is cultural clash. What's happened in New Zealand is the latest horror in what has been happening in so many places around the world.
Well, you've said the movement of Islamic people to countries such as New Zealand. So I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming you agree with Queensland Senator Fraser Anning, who basically blamed...
I don't know why you would assume that I'd agree with Fraser Anning. I mean, Fraser Anning is an extraordinarily inexperienced person who has absolutely no idea how to put any kind of argument, and he is an extremist of the worst possible kind.
Well, he said exacerbated by
heading towards
the
being
movement.
Involved with neo-Nazis.
Okay,
so
but hold on for a
nothing
second.
In common with Fraser Anning whatsoever.
So let's get clarity here, right? You said it's exacerbated by immigration of Muslim people to countries like New Zealand. He said Muslims may have been the victims today. Usually they are the perpetrators. The real cause of bloodshed on New Zealand streets today is the immigration program which allowed Muslim fanatics to migrate to New Zealand in the first place. With that last sentence, I don't see much of a difference between what you said and what he said. So I'm asking you to clarify, David.
Well, there's a vast difference, I suppose, in the sense that a very simplistic way of putting what it is that Anning is saying is that if Muslims weren't in traditionally non-Muslim countries, then this wouldn't happen. I mean, that's a very primitive way of looking at these things. Clearly, Muslim people do live in countries which are essentially Western nations, like New Zealand, like the United States, like Australia, and of course so many European countries. The Muslims are there. It's not like they're going to leave. No one's going to get rid of them in that sense. So, I mean, Anning has no answer to any of these things. He's simply an extremist who fumbles an argument that's not very well made, and its premises is quite frankly primitive.
CJ Werleman, have we underestimated the threat of right-wing white supremacism?
Oh, absolutely we have. And I just want to push back on something David just said. I mean, this was a classic case of whataboutism. I mean, yes, Christian minorities in certain countries are persecuted, as are Hindu minorities, as are Jewish minorities. But the fact stands alone that in the United States, in Australia, and most parts of the Western world, you can say things about Muslims that you could never get away with saying about other minorities. And this is where the crux of the problem is. I mean, in Australia, you have a problem with the media, politicians, and pundits have capitalized on Islamophobia for easy page clicks, for easy vote getting, to sell their books, to build their profiles. I mean, and this is being supported by a mainstream media in Australia. In fact, a study just came out a couple of weeks ago showing that Murdoch-owned newspapers, which represents a giant slice of the Australian media landscape, produced almost 3,000 negative stories about Muslims and Muslims in Islam in a single 12-month period, which represents 8 negative stories about Muslims per day, every day, for an entire year. And you have conservative columnists who sympathise with the One Nation Party, that sympathise with much of the policies of the current government, which posit Muslims to be foreign invaders. Andrew Bolt, who is a popular columnist in the Murdoch newspaper or the conservative media landscape, has referred to Muslims as foreign invaders who are a threat to Australia's white identity. Now, how can anyone look at what these mainstream politicians, these mainstream pundits are saying, and how is that any different to the manifesto which was put out by Brenton Tarrant?
David?
No, I don't think any of that is especially unfair or inaccurate. I mean, quite clearly, the media, being the business that it is, much of it, not necessarily all of it. I mean, if we look at Australia's ABC, for example, it's not at all as I'm about to describe. But, you know, the fact is that a number of polls taken over the years have shown that a very, very large percentage of Australians are at the very least uncomfortable with Muslim immigration. One of the more recent polls showed that to be about 48 or 50%. So a very large segment of the Australian population is uncomfortable, at the very least uncomfortable. Some feel much stronger than that about Muslims coming to Australia.
But isn't that
so
because of what One Nation is telling them about Muslims?
Desire to use that,
David,
is certainly accurate.
Isn't that because this is what they're being told about Muslims by parties like One Nation?
Oh, I think it would be extraordinarily naive to think that the media acts on what it is that it's being told by One Nation. I mean, the situation between Islam and Christianity and the Jewish people goes back a very, very long way. It's got nothing to do with anything that's been manifested recently by Murdoch or anybody else.
Okay, so let me ask Farid to come in here. Farid, because David appeals to history here and says, well, you know, this has been going on for thousands of years. It predates all our contemporary politics. How would you respond to that?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, well, there is a long history of antipathy, but there is also a long history of cooperation and dialogue and living together. So you can make sense of history in every kind of direction. I think the question is not only like what is the media telling the people. It's also what not only the media, but also the politicians, the academics. It's so many people who are in a position of power. To what have they been telling the people on the grassroots level throughout the last 20 to 30 years? And this is, I think, really the question, because it's not only a media issue. It's like when Donald Trump says, for instance, Islam hates us, then what he is basically doing is he's dehumanizing a whole group of people, right? When Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is saying that Muslim people are invading our continent and are invading our country. What is he doing? He is arguing that people who come here just are destroying the basis of our living together. When a chancellor like Sebastian Kurz of Austria is speaking that all Muslim kindergartens have to be closed because they are radicalized in these institutions, then what is he doing? He's basically dehumanizing all Muslim educational institutions. So the dehumanization is the basis for an act like this terrorist attack, because other than you cannot destroy, you cannot annihilate a whole group of people if you not dehumanize them. And I think that's what I've been referring to. That's really the larger picture in what how we have to look at this issue. It's really about the dehumanization of the Muslim other. And this is not something which has always been there. It is something that is deliberately chosen by those people who are in power. Let's take the best example. After 9/11, George W. Bush immediately went to the mosque and said Islam is a religion of peace. Why did he do this? Because he did not want to have any conflict on a domestic level within the United States between Muslim people and the rest of the society. That's why he did it. It was a deliberate choice. When Donald Trump says Islam hates us, this is a deliberate choice again. It's not based on any facts and figures. It's his imagination. It's the way he wants to mobilize the electorate and exclude people from our collective identity of who's American in that case.
Let me bring in CJ here, because we have Farid listing a bunch of leaders who he feels have been irresponsible in terms of how they create a tone for how their electorates view Muslims. And we've seen a response from New Zealand's Prime Minister in the days after the massacre, reaching out to the community, embracing the community, saying you are in no way responsible for this. What have you made of that, CJ?
I mean, she's been remarkable. I mean, not only has she expressed sympathy and grief and empathy with the families of the victims, but she's done so in a way that's just remarkably genuine. The problem is, and let's get the facts of the story right. The terrorist was Australian, but then you have Scott Morrison, the current Prime Minister of Australia, who in 2011 urged his shadow cabinet to capitalise on growing anxieties that Australians have towards Muslims, urging his fellow party to espouse Islamophobic beliefs, believing that would be a path to victory in the next election. I mean, this is how Islamophobia, coming back to my earlier point, is seen as something which can garner political victory, which is also reinforced by the media that sees it's an easy way to gaining page views and page clicks and advertising subscription. So we have a double whammy effect where what were once far right-wing views being espoused by far right-wing groups and neo-Nazis and fascists of all stripes, well, they're talking points and conspiracies about Sharia law conspiracies about Muslim demographic time bombs, that Muslims are going to invade Western Europe, have a secret plot to overtake Western democracies and subvert that and implement Sharia law. Well, these kind of conspiracies have made themselves, move from the fringe corners of the dark web into mainstream political course, espoused by mainstream and political leaders in the country. Okay,
so as we try and unpack this, right, let me ask you, David, then, we look at Brenton Tarrant's manifesto. It's a mix of all sorts of grievances. Often many of them are contradictory, as is often the case with a lot of extremists. There's stuff about being against the Ottomans. It's telling those of us who live in Istanbul, stay on the Asian side, don't stay on the European side. It has problems with the siege of Vienna. It looks at every kind of success of any kind of Muslim empire over the years as some major scar on the face of Christianity. Amid all of that stuff, does the man have some legitimate grievances, David?
Well, in his mind, he has, and certainly in the minds of quite a lot of people, he has, and they have. Look, I personally don't see any great future with Muslim and non-Muslim people getting along in a very short
But what's
time.
Legitimate in there, David?
These are issues that are across the world. I mean, for example, you only have to look at Japan and see how unenthusiastic Japan is, for example, to have Muslim people migrate there.
But I'm asking you very simply, David, what's legitimate?
Any kind. I think we're kind of losing perspective here as to what's taking place. This is a general international clash of culture. Now, yes, the media may pick up on it to sell newspapers and get people to watch news programs. And yes, politicians may pick up on it to get themselves votes. But I really think that's just scratching the surface of a very big problem that's been going for quite some time, which is very easily solved, and that is the politics and the news of fear, and people are frightened. Are those fears well-founded? Is Islam really a threat to Western civilization? Well, those are questions that a lot of people actually have, and it's foolish to think that they don't.
But you're legitimizing it, and I'm asking you, what is the problem then? What's legitimate about his fear? Can you give me an example?
Well, that's not for me to give an example, because I'm not him, and I'm not one of his supporters.
But you're saying a lot of people feel this, so tell me.
There are not a lot of people.
As an Aussie politician who's anti-immigration,
fortunately, there are not a lot of people who will walk into a building and murder people. Okay. Fortunately, there are not very many of them.
Let me ask it another way.
There are probably quite a few people
David,
who understand why he did what he did.
David,
I'm not one of them.
Okay,
I don't agree with what he did.
Okay, let me ask it another way then. 50 people have been killed, 40 have been wounded, right? I'm asking you, what did they do wrong to invite the anger of this man? Because you're saying there's a problem and a lot of people recognize this problem. What did they do wrong besides being Muslim and being at a mosque?
I don't think they did anything wrong apart from that. And was that wrong? And no, they were in their mosque. They were worshipping their God in their place of worship. I don't think those people did anything wrong. I think that sadly they were the victims of a much wider problem, and how it could be seen any other way is beyond me.
CJ, victims of a much wider problem. I
mean, it's just patently absurd. I mean, the fact that, you know, David has just trotted out the old Clash of Civilizations thesis, which was made famous by Samuel Hafez.
No, I said Clash of Cultures. Yeah. It's not a Clash of Civilization. Well, it's a clash of culture.
Okay, well, how do you explain in that case how Israel and Saudi Arabia have become best friends against the Islamic Republic of Iran? I mean, these are not clashes of culture. These are not clashes of civilization. Muslims were invisible citizens. I mean, you helped bring a person like Pauline Hanson into national prominence in Australia. This is a person who launched a political career talking about Asians in the mid and late 90s. But then when the Tampa affair came along, and then 9/11 came along, she suddenly talked about Muslims because Muslims were fashionable to bash. Muslims have been invisible.
I wasn't with her at that time, but surely you can't be so naive as to not simply understand that politics use all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. Surely you can't be seriously that naive, and you can't be seriously naive to not understand that the Jewish people are so smart that they will do whatever they need that will better and defend and keep Israel intact at any time, as will the Americans, as will the majority of Australians, as I'm sure will most people in Turkey. Everyone is interested in their own self-interest. Mostly everyone, is interested in their own national identity, their own culture, their own people. It really is naivety in the extreme to try and pretend that this is something else.
Okay, CJ, and then Farid. CJ, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to answer that. I mean, as far as being naive, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm a journalist who covers the Middle East full time. I've studied terrorism at the academic level. I've probably interviewed more jihadists, Islamic jihadists, Western recruits than most Western journalists in the world. So I know what makes these guys tick. A problem is
but there. You don't seem to know what it is that makes the people who don't like them tick. You might know jihadis inside out, but it seems to me you don't have any understanding of why it is that a lot of Australians, a lot of New Zealanders, a lot of Americans, and a lot of people throughout Europe, especially in Germany and France, are not very happy about Muslims.
Well, he just laid it out for you. He said
my view.
Okay, he laid it out.
This is available everywhere.
David, the man. Hold on, gentlemen. Because we're running out of time, CJ and David. Okay,
or have them apply.
Okay, David. CJ just laid it out at the beginning of the argument as to why he felt it was institutional. Nevertheless, I'm running out of time, so I need to get a response from Farid. Farid, wrap us up before I move on.
All right. I think, if we speak and refer to this Muslim category in the political discourse, this is already the failure, right? The whole issue about the so-called Muslim problem is an invention of nationalism and racism. Because what we are doing What we have been doing the last 2 to 3 decades is to Islamize simply every political, social, economic issue that we are referring to. And what we are doing is we are actually depoliticizing the whole political structures that are behind these problems and make them a Muslim problem. And that is where we are at. So if some people argue that, well, there is reasonable fear, there are reasons for why people feel uncomfortable, I mean, this is because they are made to fear something like that, right? Anti-Semitism was invented by racist scholars. Anti-black racism was invented by racist scholars. This was scholarship, this was politicians who perpetrated these kinds of ideologies. This is not coming from the people. Don't tell me something like this, because it's coming from the power positions, from those who very explicitly, deliberately try to use these kind of ideologies for their own political purpose.
Okay.
This is what is behind the figure of the Jew, the figure of the black, the figure of the Muslim, the figure of everybody that is positioned as somebody who is racially inferior.
Okay, gentlemen, this is not the last time we're going to talk about this, and a little bit later on we're going to have a deeper dive into what drives the white supremacist ideology. But for now, I've got to move on. Farid Hafez, CJ Werleman, and David Oldfield, thanks for joining us. So what's it like inside the mind of the attacker? Well, let's ask someone who once held similar views. Frank Mink is a former white supremacist. He became a skinhead when he was only 13. By 18, he was a neo-Nazi leader and recruiter before going to prison and eventually leaving that life behind. He joins us now from Des Moines in Iowa. Frank, really good to have you on the Newsmakers. Horrific news coming out of New Zealand. And once you started to see the news of the alleged shooter, killer, and his manifesto, could you, at least the former you, relate to some of the stuff that he was thinking and saying?
Absolutely. What I would say, when I started to watch when they were first showing the video of the shootings, I had to stop. I stopped watching. And I started to look a little bit more into the guy. And then I said, I didn't want to give him too much of my time, of my life, because he's already taken enough people's whole lives and their time. But what I can tell you is that when you wake up and you're in one of those groups, the minute I woke up, the instant thing I thought of was, why did black people have BET and white people don't have white entertainment television? Like, I constantly, every day, thought of things that made me angry. And it fed to my ego that I know, no self-esteem, and it just fed to all that. So he woke up the same way. Every morning he wakes up and hate is the first thing on your mind. So
Frank, you and I are not as young as some of these people right now who grew up in the sort of, well, I don't know. I'm looking at you, and we look of a similar age. I don't know. maybe it's my beard, or it's both of our beards. But a lot of people grow up as digital natives now, right? And so perhaps with your extremism, and I'm presuming a lot here, a lot of the grievances were sort of local, right? So you have like local chapters of the neo-Nazis that you could join, or KKK, or whatever it is. But this guy had the internet, and he was able to stitch together a whole lot of things. Breivik and Serbs and Albanians and alt-right and all sorts of stuff stirred in the pot. Is that something that's new, and is it something that makes radicalization easier because they have a kind of global community to join?
No, I mean, it's quite easy now. And the way that this movement is growing is where you have the angry, say, white kid that comes home and a Muslim kid made fun of him. Now, just happens for kids. Now he goes home, he starts getting on the internet, he starts looking for anti-Muslim websites. And it starts just because before you had time to think. A guy made fun of me, I went home, I sat about, I was mad, I go home, see him in school the next day, who knows. But now I get to go home and I get to bring all the anger with me, and I get to find people that talk just like I want to talk right now, angry, hateful. I mean, look at Fox News we have in America. It's like this basic hate speech, and it just feeds into this stuff constantly. It's all fear-based. It's all men full of fear.
How do you deprogram the anger? Well,
another great former neo-Nazi taught me this a long time ago. He said that we didn't give up our humanity when we joined. We didn't lose our humanity. We gave it up when we joined for acceptance. And so that goes back to the same argument real quick with the Nazi guards at the concentration camps. Do we hold them responsible for what they, being just guards, were they just doing their job, like they were just soldiers? So everyone has this way in them. Most people aren't so evil, but I know that when we can teach empathy again, and empathy plus humility equals humanity. And when you can practice that in yourself, it doesn't mean the world has to do anything for you. You just practice it yourself and see how much better your life gets. And when we do that, you can't go argue with neo-Nazis or Muslim extremists. You can't go argue with them about the basic beliefs of that, because all you're going to do is argue. But if I can talk to them about human life stuff, about having daughters, being a dad of a teenage daughter. I mean, every guy in the world has empathy for each other if you have a teenage daughter, you know?
What if, yes, you can convince someone that killing people is bad based on your beliefs or their beliefs, but they're in so deep and they have a community of brothers and they have community. How do you extract them from that?
Well, if we have someone that's that deep in and they can't get out being closer, then we would probably, as a group like Life After Hate, which is an organization that helps with that type of stuff, we would extract them and move them. But you usually do have to get them away from people, places, and things. Right? It's just like an alcoholic. You got to get away from the bars. You know, if he keeps going to the neo-Nazi hang shop just to be friends with them, he's still going to believe the beliefs. So, yes, you do have to, and that's what I had to do. I had to separate completely from him. One day I just stopped talking. I mean, it wasn't one day, but when I decided to make the decision, I just stopped calling them. I stopped going where they were. If I had tickets to a concert and they were all there, whatever, I'll sell the tickets. I ain't going. I just stayed away from them for a while until they jumped me.
I wonder what your opinion is about sharing content from the massacre, or at least sharing some of the images and so on, because there's an argument to say, don't share ISIS videos because it will encourage more people to join ISIS. A lot of people are saying, don't share the video that this guy shot while he was going about his rampage. Would you agree with that?
No, you should show, you should show anything. I mean, I'm not a big believer in, limiting people's freedom of speech or hate speech. You got to let people talk. If not, they bottle it up and they get more and more angry inside, and then you have more of these things. So, I mean, even this horrific, if you want to go watch someone get shot and killed and you think it's cool, then you need to check your life. Because I know that I had access to watch this, and I won't watch it because I have so many Muslim friends that, I mean, for real friends. I was just with my boy Jamal this morning just talking about all this. And it's just crazy that I couldn't watch it because I thought of him and his wife going to the mosque in the morning. Or that's what, what could have happened. And I have empathy. And that's what I mean. That's where that empathy comes in. I have empathy for the world. I have empathy for people. I can't hate you if I have empathy for you.
Frank, really good to have you on the Newsmakers. Hope you'll join us again sometime soon.
Thank you.